Hello, and welcome to this lecture discussing the brain. My name is Laura McLeod, and I'm an instructor here at Ultimate Medical Academy. In this lecture, we'll be going over the different parts of the brain and what their functions are. Let's get started. The brain. How amazing is this part of our body? It does so much, but so many people know very little about it. The adult human brain is a highly developed, complex, and intricate mass of soft nervous tissue. It weighs about 3 pounds and consists of 100 billion neurons. The brain itself is protected by the bony cranial cavity. It is further protected by 3 membranous coverings called the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid. An adequate amount of oxygenated blood supply is needed for the brain to work properly. The fact is, if a person is without oxygen for 4 to 8 minutes, then brain damage can occur. The brain is actually divided into 4 major parts. There's the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Now, the cerebrum is actually the largest part of the brain, and in fact, it occupies the entire upper part of the skull. The diencephalon, now this is located between the cerebrum and the midbrain, and includes 2 major structures, the thalamus and hypothalamus. The cerebellum, this is located behind the pons and below the cerebrum. Finally, the brainstem. This is located at the base of the brain and is made up of 3 parts, the midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. Our brain acts like a huge library of stored information that we have either witnessed, learned, or thought about. The information can either be new or old. Scientists actually believe the hippocampus of the limbic system acts like a receptionist. Weird, but it's true. It acts like a receptionist because it decides the significance of the event and determines where to store or file it within our brain. We can either have a short-term or long-term memory. This is decided depending on how much attention we give an event, how many times we repeat the activity, and the kinds of memory associations. The 3 meninges, as mentioned earlier, are the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Dura mater is the outer brain covering, which lines the skull. This is tough, dense membrane of fibrous connective tissue. It contains a lot of blood vessels. The arachnoid mater is the middle layer and resembles a cobweb with fluid-filled spaces. The pia mater is covering the surface of the brain itself and consists of blood vessels held together by fine areolar connective tissue. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid is actually found in the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid and pia mater. This fluid is produced within the ventricles of the brain, and its purpose is actually to act as a shock absorber as well as a source of nutrients for the brain. Within the brain, there are ventricles. These are the 4 lined cavities that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Each of the 4 ventricles contains a rich network of blood vessels of the pia mater, referred to as the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is in contact with the cells lining the ventricles, which helps in the formation of cerebrospinal fluid. The 2 largest ventricles are located within the cerebral hemispheres and are known as the right and left lateral ventricles. The 3rd ventricle is placed behind and below the lateral ventricles. It is connected to the 2 lateral ventricles via the interventricular foramen. The 4th ventricle is situated below the 3rd, in front of the cerebellum and behind the pons and medulla oblongata, the brainstem. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid, as mentioned before, is a substance that forms inside the forebrain ventricles from the blood vessels of the choroid plexuses. This fluid serves as a liquid shock absorber, protecting the delicate brain and the spinal cord as well. It is formed by filtration from the intricate capillary network of the choroid plexuses. The fluid actually transports nutrients to, removes metabolic waste products from the brain cells. Choroid plexus capillaries differ significantly in their selective permeability from capillaries in other areas of the body. As a result, drugs that are carried in the bloodstream may not effectively penetrate brain tissue, rendering brain infections difficult to cure. This phenomenon is commonly referred to as the blood-brain barrier. Removal of the cerebrospinal fluid for a diagnostic purpose is accomplished with a lumbar puncture, also known as a spinal tap. The needle used to withdraw the cerebrospinal fluid is inserted between the third and fourth lumbar vertebra. The spinal cord actually ends at the second lumbar vertebra. Any changes in composition of the fluid that's withdrawn can be an indication of injury, infection, or disease. A spinal tap also serves to alleviate the pressure caused by meningitis and especially hydrocephalus. Let's go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into the brain. Break it up into parts. First, we're going to talk about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and weighs about 2 pounds. It occupies the whole upper part of the skull. Covering the upper and lower surface of the cerebrum is a layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. The cerebrum is divided into 2 hemispheres, the right and the left, by a deep groove known as the longitudinal fissure. The cerebral surface is completely covered with furrows and ridges. The deeper furrows or grooves are referred to as fissures. The shallower ones are called sulci. The elevated ridges between the sulci are the gyra, or convolutions. These convolutions serve to increase the surface area of the brain, resulting in a proportionally larger amount of gray matter. The arrangement of the gyra and sulci on the brain's surface varies from one brain to another. So you could say no 2 brains are alike. Certain fissures, however, are constant and represent important demarcations. That means parts of the brain. They help localize specific functional areas of the cerebrum and divide each hemisphere into 4 total lobes. There are actually 5 major fissures. First, the longitudinal fissure, which is a deep groove that divides the cerebrum into 2 hemispheres. Then, the transverse fissure, which divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Then, there's the central fissure, which divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobes. Then the lateral fissure, which divides the frontal lobe and the temporal lobes. And finally, there's the parieto-occipital fissure, or sulci, the least obvious of all fissures. It serves to separate the occipital lobe from the parietal and temporal lobes. Although no definite demarcation or line between these 2 lobes exist. The cerebrum is divided into different lobes. There's the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and there is a 5th one, the limbic lobe, or in some references, it is considered a system, not an actual lobe. Looking at these 2 figures, you can follow along while I go over the different functions of the different lobes. First, the frontal lobe. This forms the anterior portion of each hemisphere. It controls voluntary muscle movement. Cells in the right hemisphere activate movements that occur in the left side of the body, while on the left hemisphere, controls movements on the right side of the body. The frontal lobe includes the area that makes speech possible. This is usually located in the left hemisphere, also called the Broca area. When you see a right-sided paralysis in someone with a stroke, his or her speech is usually affected because of this. Damage to this area means that you may know what to say, but you can't vocalize the words. Second, the parietal lobe. This is located behind the frontal lobe. It receives and interprets nerve impulses from the sensory receptors for pain, touch, heat, cold, and balance. It further helps determine distance, sizes, and shapes. Now, the occipital lobe is actually located over the cerebellum and houses the visual area controlling eyesight. No, it's not actually in the front of the brain, it's in the back of the brain. Now, the temporal lobe, this is located beneath the frontal and parietal lobes. The anterior portion is occupied by the olfactory or smell area. And the temporal lobe contains the auditory area. The Wernicke area of the temporal lobe is a central language area for speech understanding and comprehension. The limbic lobe or system, depending on which reference you're looking at, is actually located at the center of the brain beneath the other four lobes. It encircles the top of the brainstem. The limbic system influences unconscious and instinctive behaviors that relate to survival. The behavior is modified by the action of the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is part of the limbic system and is actually considered the brain of the brain. Through the use of feedback, the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary gland to release its hormones. Vital functions performed by the hypothalamus are the autonomic nervous control. This regulates the parasympathetic and sympathetic systems of the autonomic nervous system. It goes into cardiovascular control, which controls blood pressure, regulating the constriction and dilation of blood vessels and the beating of the heart. It controls temperature, helps in the maintenance of normal body temperature. It controls your appetite, assists in regulating the amount of food we ingest. The feeding center, found in the lateral hypothalamus, is stimulated by hunger pangs, which prompt us to eat. In turn, the satiety center in the medial hypothalamus becomes stimulated when we have eaten enough. Water balance is another thing that hypothalamus does. Within the hypothalamus, certain cells respond to the osmotic pressure of the blood. When osmotic pressure is high due to water deficiency, the antidiuretic hormone is secreted. A thirst area is found near the satiety area, becoming stimulated when the blood's osmolality is high. This causes us to consume more liquids. Yes, the hypothalamus does even more. It manufactures oxytocin. This contracts the uterus during labor. It has gastrointestinal control, which increases intestinal peristalsis and secretion from the intestinal glands. It controls your emotional state, plays a role in the display of emotions such as fear and pleasure. It also controls sleep, helps keep us awake when necessary. Mind over body experiences. The hypothalamus may be involved in cases of patients who, when diagnosed with terminal illness, refuse to accept the diagnosis and experience an unexplainable cure. Here, we're going to look a little bit more into the cerebellum. The cerebellum is located behind the pons and below the cerebrum. It consists of two hemispheres, or wings, the right cerebellar hemisphere and the left cerebellar hemisphere. These two hemispheres are connected to a central portion called the vermis. The cerebellum consists of gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. The white matter is marked with a tree-like pattern called arbor vitae, meaning tree of life. The cerebellum communicates with the rest of the central nervous system by three pairs of tracts called peduncles. These three peduncles are composed of incoming axons that carry nerve messages into the cerebellum and outgoing axons that transmit messages out of the cerebellum. The incoming axons carry messages to the cerebellum regarding movement within joints, muscle tone, position of body, and tightness of ligaments and tendons. Any and all information relating to skeletal muscle activity is carried to the cerebellum. This information reaches the cerebellum directly from sensory receptors, including the inner ear, the eye, and the proprioceptors in skeletal muscle. The outgoing axons carry nerve messages to the different parts of the brain that control skeletal muscles. Let's look at the functions of the cerebellum. The cerebellum controls all body functions that have to do with skeletal muscles. For example, maintenance of balance. If the body is imbalanced, sensory receptors in the inner ear and nerve messages to the cerebellum. There, the cerebellum carries impulses to the motor controlling areas of the brain. These brain areas, in turn, stimulate muscle contraction, which move the body to restore balance. Coordination of muscle movements. Any voluntary movement is initiated in the cerebral cortex. However, once the movement is started, its smooth execution is the role of the cerebellum. The cerebellum allows each muscle to contract at the right time with the right strength and for the right amount of time, so that the overall movement is smooth and flowing. This is important when doing complex or skilled movements, such as speaking, walking, or writing. Even simple movements need the coordinating abilities of the cerebellum. A simple action, such as raising the hand to the face to avoid a blow, requires the synchronized action of 50 or more muscles. These muscles then act on 30 separate bones of the arm and hand. The removal of or injury to the cerebellum results in motor impairment. The brainstem is made up of three parts: the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. The brainstem provides a pathway for the ascending and descending tracts. These are messages going to the cerebrum and messages coming back from the cerebrum. Extending the length of the brainstem is the gray matter of the reticular formation system. These are the neurons that are involved in the sleep-wake cycle. A coma results if there is damage to this area. The pons, or bridge, is located in front of the cerebellum, between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. The pons serves as a two-way conductive pathway for nerve impulses between the cerebrum, cerebellum, and other areas of the nervous system. The pons is also the site for the emergence of 4 pairs of cranial nerves, and it contains a center that controls respiration. The spinal cord continues down from the brain. It begins at the foramen magnum of the occipital bone and continues to the second lumbar vertebra. It is white and soft and lies within the vertebra of the spinal column. It is made up of a series of 31 segments, each giving rise to a pair of spinal nerves. The spinal cord is also protected by 3 layers of meninges. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates to bathe the spinal cord. The meninges do not attach to the vertebra. They are separated by the epidural space. This space contains loose connective tissue and adipose tissue that further protects the spinal cord. The gray matter in the spinal cord is located in the internal section, The white matter composes the outer part. In the gray matter of the cord, connections can be made between incoming and outgoing nerve fibers, which provide the basis for reflex action. A major function of the spinal cord is to carry messages from the sensory neurons to the brain for interpretation. The response is carried back from the brain through the motor neurons to the muscles and glands. The second major function is to serve as the reflex center for the body. I want to thank you for attending this lecture. If you have any further questions about this topic, please don't hesitate to reach out to your instructor.